Good and live?
All right,
Awesome.
we are live. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I hope you've had a wonderful start to MozFest. My name is Sarah Aoun. I'm a human rights technologist, and I'll be one of your hosts for the next hour for this really, really special session that I hope you'll all enjoy. For those who don't know me, I used to be actually an Open Web Fellow back in 2017, and I'm now the Chief Technologist at the Open Tech Fund. And let me tell you a bit about what we're doing here today. Most of us watching, including myself, like I said, are members of this greater Mozilla community and this greater Mozilla family. And we're also all citizens of the global internet. And with that, I think we're all at least a little bit aware that there's a very specific and complex relationship between data and power. And this is exactly why we're here today and what we're going to be talking about. To talk about the role that Mozilla plays in internet, in data health, and the impact that that has on digital and human rights overall. And with that in mind, I would like to introduce you to one of my co-hosts actually for this session. And he is, of course, one of the hosts behind the scenes for this entire event this week. Please welcome me please join me in welcoming Mozilla's Executive Director, Mark Sermon.
Thank you, Sarah. It's funny to have me in Toronto and you in Brooklyn doing this, doing this session. I remember last time we actually saw each other in person when we were able to get on airplanes was also talking about the politics of the internet, but in a bar in Tunisia at RightsCon 2019. So things are different, but good. It's good to have you here. And when J Bob and I were brainstorming about who should co-host this plenary, she said, well, what about Sarah Aoun? And I thought that is a perfect idea. You're such an amazing technologist and activist, and you've been a great collaborator for us. So I appreciate you being here today.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for having me. And it's really good to be here and to be back again in the Mozilla family to host this session with you. And as you know, back to that bar in Tunisia, I've always been at this intersection of technology and human rights. Which is very similar to a lot of the work that Mozilla is doing and has been doing for a long time. So for everyone else who's here with us today, let me tell you a bit about what to expect for the next session. We're going to be exploring these topics around data and power. And for that, we have three really amazing speakers coming on to talk about that and present some of the work on that. But before we get to them, Mark, can you tell us a little bit more about why you picked that topic and why we're specifically thinking about data and power and that dynamic today?
Yeah, totally happy to. We've always used the MozFest plenaries as a time to look at a theme that is especially resonant with the Mozilla community at a particular moment in time. And when I think about this journey, actually, I think about this slide, maybe cue the slide. It's a slide about how strategy isn't something that just goes in a straight line, or the evolution of ideas doesn't go in a straight line. It actually kind of wanders around. If you go to the next slide, that's actually kind of how I think about the 10 years of topics we've been talking about at MozFest. So we've gone from open source and the open web in the beginning, all through lots of different paths to the focus on trustworthy AI today. But through all of this, the core ideas in the conversation have been the same: championing openness, privacy, security, inclusion, and creating an internet that is open and accessible to all. So we've been in the moment always, but on the same path, even if we've kind of wound a little bit. So this year we decided, in the same spirit, to focus specifically on shifting power dynamics around data because it's so central to Mozilla's trustworthy AI agenda. And we all know that things are broken. One of the things that is broken about the internet is who controls data. And with this plenary, we wanted to go and bring in some speakers who aren't just talking about what is broken in the world of data, but who are doing something to fix it. So that's what you're going to hear in a moment. But before we do that, Sarah, as a technologist, I wanted to ask you, how do you think about issues around data and power?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Mark. AI is such a big topic and a big field, but when I think about it, AI is definitely going to shape and define the way that we move forward as a society. And the world of AI that I live in my day-to-day work feels really like a dystopian future. Like I spend most of my days really thinking about the type of AI that reinforces bias, the type of AI that helps automate surveillance, for example. So in thinking about that, for instance, like repressive regimes in the world are using AI today to automate censorship and surveillance efforts. And that's something that I'm working on all the time, which makes censorship and surveillance easier, faster, and cheaper than ever. If you take the Chinese government, for example, they're using AI to rapidly identify and block circumvention tools and circumvention techniques that people are using in China. So this in the past used to take months to implement, and right now it's literally just a matter of days or hours. But if you want to bring this closer to home and think about another example a bit closer to home, and we can cue up the slide for that, robo-dogs just a few weeks ago were deployed in New York City and are being tested on low-income communities, such as the Bronx in New York. And I mean, that's obviously not the first time that technology is being used to reinforce bias and racism. And a lot of us know that. Like, we've been talking about this and we've been thinking about this for a long time. And the idea of AI is that by removing the human factor, AI is supposed to be a sort of equalizer. But there's really an asymmetry of power between the people who own the code and the folks who are on the receiving end of this algorithmic harm. And we've seen like the impacts basically of that, and we know that everyone has unconscious bias that's undeniable, and people embed their own biases in technology when they're developing technology. Because the reality at the end of the day is like technology is, these systems are designed by people like us, like you and I sitting here today, like a lot of people listening to this talk right now, from fairly privileged backgrounds. And we're designing the systems based on our own understanding of the world. But that does not always end up being the best use case for the people that these systems serve in the end. And if we're not thinking about those folks in advance when we're making these design decisions, this is how we essentially end up failing in that process.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And we see that all the time now, whether it's like not considering different communities and the impact on people in the design, or like considering society. And we've seen a lot of dark and scary and confusing things happen as we lean more on data and AI to make decisions for us. On the flip side, like increasingly I meet people who are trying to push things in the opposite direction. People who are actually building technology today that has the potential to, by design, take us closer to a more just and humane digital world. And so our three speakers today, Kathleen, James, Brandy, they're all examples of these kind of people. And I'm hoping they can inspire more of us to do this kind of work. So I think we should start. I want to start with Kathleen Siminu. She is a language and speech researcher and the regional coordinator of AI for development. And she's also a part of Masakani, a grassroots organization whose mission is to strengthen natural language processing research in African languages for Africans by Africans, which she'll talk a little bit in a moment.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Kathleen, are you ready to come on? And if you are, everyone else, Mozilla community, please let's give a warm welcome to our first speaker today, who's coming from Nairobi, Kenya. So Kathleen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark and Sarah, for that introduction. The title of my talk is A Series of Whys, and as you will see, that is exactly what my talk is composed of. As I walk you through my journey as an engineer, my involvement with some AI communities, and subsequently venturing into research. Next slide, please. When I was much younger, I wanted to become a doctor. Why? Perhaps because both my parents are. Perhaps because at some point it was one of few professions considered prestigious in the African context. Whatever the case, when I was 16, I spent a couple of months doing community service at a hospital and learned that I did not have the stomach to study medicine. Watching people suffer day in, day out literally sucked the energy out of me. Next slide, please. This is my first laptop, which my mom got me when I started uni. I named it Faith. Why? So that I could say to myself when appropriate, have a little faith, Kathleen. and then respond to myself, but I do, referring to my little laptop Faith, which weighed about 12 kgs, by the way, so it wasn't that little. After realizing I couldn't become a doctor, I made the decision to study math and computer science. Why? Because I really enjoyed math in high school, and math and physics were two of my strongest subjects. During my undergrad years, I discovered data science and decided that it was a career path I wanted to go down. Why? I found data science more interesting and exciting than web and mobile development, which is a path I had started on. I started doing some online courses as well as some projects in the final year of my undergrad. And when I was done with school, I was intent on getting someone to hire me as a data scientist. Next slide, please. I landed my first job as a data scientist at a company working in the telco space in Africa. I think it was the best first job anyone could ever ask for. Why? Because they trusted me with a job that had not been done, a job that no one in the company knew how to do. I was their first hire for the data department. They also recognized that I myself was still very green, having not been professionally trained as a data scientist, and they supported my technical growth by paying for me to attend summer schools and conferences. Next slide, please. This job also allowed me to get a taste of working particularly in languages and the challenges of trying to innovate for African languages. As I've mentioned, it was a company in the telco space, and one of our products was SMS. It happened to be an election year one year, and what typically, unfortunately, happens in my country is that the country will be divided along tribal lines for political purposes every election year. The spread of hate speech had been a problem in previous election years, so the Communication Authority was being very strict about ensuring operators did not let any hate speech be sent using their infrastructure. What that looked like for us internally was thinking through a technical solution to identify and therefore stop hate speech. And the most elegant thing we could come up with, which was extremely inelegant in my opinion, was first, to pass with a language identifier, to pass the messages with a language identifier. If the message was in English, we could pass a text for keywords that might signal hate speech and block those messages for manual inspection. Messages in all other languages were automatically stopped and needed manual inspection. To put this in context, we have over 44 different tribes, and therefore 44 plus different languages are spoken in the country. Messages in Kiswahili, which is also a national language in the country, could be verified by anyone in the office. And for good measure, because of the tribal dynamics of elections, we simply barred all messages that were not in either English or Kiswahili. The fact that there were no tools to support better analysis of text in other languages spoken in the country is probably what got me on intent on working particularly in NLP. Next slide, please. I have also spent a lot of my time building and supporting data science, machine learning, and generally AI communities on the African continent. Why? Because as many of them are focused first and foremost on capacity building, it has always been a great way to ensure that I have avenues to grow my technical skill, as well as interact with others in the same professional field. Beyond that, they helped me to situate myself within tech and particularly within AI. Women in Machine Learning and Data Science creates a platform via which women can explore and venture into AI careers. Through my journey venturing into tech, I'd become aware of the fact that there were less and less women the further along I got. In my undergrad class, I was one of 4 women in a class of 55. At my first job, I was one of 2 women on the tech team out of about 10 to start with. So it was important for me to create pathways for other women to enter the field. I co-organized the Nairobi chapter for 3 years, and we went on to hire from that community when the time came to grow the data department at my place of work. Next slide, please. Which brings me back to my desire to work on language tools for African languages. Why? Because it really is a problem for which the tooling to solve already exists. It just hasn't been a research focus because there aren't nearly enough researchers that look like me that can first identify that this is a problem and then proceed to work towards solving it. Also, because language and culture are intricately linked beyond the surface meaning of words and phrases that constitute a language, there is a lot of nuance to communication, and that is heavily reliant on context, culture, and shared experiences. So I made the decision to leave industry and go back to school to get my master's. Why? Because while my job had been able to grant me the gift of breath, which was great for exploring the field, I now knew what I wanted to go deep into. And unfortunately, my job could not afford me the depth as well. I wanted to build NLP tools for African languages. It is also important to me as a leader in the African AI space to have that level of credibility. We are, after all, doing science. It's not just about tinkering with tools to see what happens. Next slide, please. Which then brings me to Masakane, yet another community I got involved in. Why? Well, Masakane is focused on specialized capacity building for African NLP research. The reason I knew Masakane was the right fit for me is because of the values that are central to the work. Masakane is a Zulu word that means we build together. This ethos pays homage to the fact that fair, responsible, and localized AI systems can only be built with the involvement of locals. One cannot just enter a community or an ecosystem and imagine that because they have technical skill, they are best suited to build technical solutions. The outcome when we are not involved in the process is already apparent. We are all now reliant on a digital space that does not understand our names, our cultures, our places, or our history. Next slide, please. Now, working in low-resource NLP is no easy task. There are many challenges. Most glaring is the lack of availability of data. Creating datasets is time-consuming and expensive, so many researchers will choose what they work on based on whether the data exists. Where the data is available, data quality is another issue. Because of the evangelical work that missionaries did in Africa during colonial times, most of the digitized resources of African language data in existence are religious texts. The use of this data exclusively leads to a phenomenon we have dubbed the biblification of systems. We noted during evaluation of the machine translation models trained within Masakane that Canada, for example, kept being translated into Canon. There is also the matter of diacritics. Many African languages have diacritics, which are the various accents you would see on letters, signaling perhaps a variation in tone. A word could mean 2 or 3 completely different things based on the diacritics that accompany it, and this level of correctness is not always respected. BBC, for example, has a news website on which they publish news in Yoruba, a language spoken widely in West Africa, but they do not bother to properly diacritize the text. Then comes the bigger challenge, where the data simply does not exist, in the cases where languages are more spoken than anything. Instances where the people that speak these languages are literally its custodians. There are actually many languages that could become extinct in coming decades. My parents belong to a tribe known as the Luya. The Luya are a group of 16 to 18 communities who have a shared sociocultural history and whose languages in some cases are very similar and mutually intelligible. It is possible for some members of different communities to communicate, each speaking their native tongues. Now, because these languages have always been relegated to the home, never used in education or other formal settings, they do not have standard writing systems, which means two individuals from one community, both fluent in their mother tongue, can disagree on the spelling of various words. Because these languages are more oral than written, speech systems would be valuable for these communities. But how does one begin to build these speech systems, given that the transcribed data does not exist? Given that standard agreed upon spelling of words also do not exist. It's the hardest, most exciting problem I've come across thus far, which is why I'm choosing to work on it. I spent the better part of last year working on transcription systems that map sounds to IPA. That's the International Phonetic Alphabet. It is a standardized representation of speech sounds in written form and should help us bypass the fact that many languages in Africa do not have formal written systems. Next slide, please. Which brings me to my parting shots. I firmly believe that the responsible thing to do when building AI technologies for marginalized communities is to natively involve them in the process, equipping them with the technical know-how and centering their experiences in development of any solutions. So I leave you with this quote: "What is done for me without me is done against me." Thank you very much.
Kathleen, thank you so much for this talk. Really inspiring. I mean, especially the last quote that you have, I think about it a lot, especially being in the field of technology and human rights, this idea of parachuting in and coming into certain contexts and building tools for people, but without including people in the development of this tool. So this idea that like you have to be inclusive in building AI and in thinking about the context that you're in is so important. And thank you for driving that point home.
Yeah, and I totally agree. Thank you, Kathleen. And this is actually at the center of the conversation we're having here around data and powers. Who's involved? Who gets to have a say? And Kathleen's story really shows how people taking control of data that matters most to them. And it's not even data; it's like their lives, their culture, their language, and that's what we're talking about. That can change the overall power dynamics. And it's, I'll say as a side piece, in line with what we're trying to do with Mozilla Common Voice, which relates a little bit to some of what Kathleen talked about and what Masakane is doing. So hopefully we can build some connections there between Common Voice and Masakane coming out of MozFest. Another person who is doing concrete things to shift power dynamics around data is James Farrar. James co-founded the Worker Info Exchange and is one of the first grantees to be supported by Mozilla's Data Futures Lab. James and his compatriots have shown that gig economy companies often use their control over data to block workers from accessing their most basic rights. And they've also shown how workers can get those rights back by taking control of their own data.
Awesome, Mark. Thank you so much. I'm really excited for this one. Everyone, please join me in welcoming our next speaker, James Farrar.
Oh, well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for having me here. I was thinking about data and power, but I was also thinking about the word purpose, and it's really been an important theme in the work that I've been doing over the past few years as I've moved from a career in software to the other side of the disruption chasm and then further on still. But the thing about purpose is that it means it's a multi-purpose word. It's a multi-purposeful word. It can mean values, as in your value set. What is your purpose? What's your purpose of what you do? It can be a function. What's the purpose of this thing we're building? But it can also be a design feature. What is the purpose of what we're designing here? What are we designing it for? And these are important aspects of software and systems design, but they're also important aspects of achieving justice, of understanding what your relationship is with an employer in society and so on. Next slide, please. So my purpose of work, I moved to not a typical career path, I might add, but I moved from a career in software at SAP to become an Uber driver, the other side of the software of the disruption chasm. And when I was at SAP, I was working in an incubator. We were craving the idea that if we could only get our hands on some disruption, I mean, we were in an enterprise software company. We dreamt of bringing social disruption to that world and what it could unleash. But we had middling results. But then I went over to Uber to see what that was like as a driver. And it was interesting. The purpose was the same. SAP wanted to make the world run better. Uber wanted to reinvent transport. All great potential purposes for society. Next slide, please. And so I signed up at the Uber office in London, and this is what I found behind the podium. Sorry about the poor quality of the picture, but this is the promise to drivers, to precarious workers, maybe coming from, let's face it, even worse employment situations than Uber. Let's be honest about it. But what he had to say, as if, is that I make 3 times more money compared to my previous courier driver job with Uber. I don't need to worry about bills. Who doesn't need to worry about bills? If my child wants a new jacket, I tell him, you know what, buy 2 of them if you want. This is life at Uber as an Uber driver. And of course, that's not the reality. The reality is it takes you about 30 hours a week to break even, because you've got to cover your running costs before you make something for yourself. It's very dangerously long hours. It's very tough work. It's very lonely work. But this is the dream that's been sold to precarious workers, that you would have this entrepreneurial freedom, and you would have this unlimited opportunity. Now, the freedom, there is something to it, because when I went in through the doors and I sat down through the session, a lot of these guys were coming from, and women, actually only 2% of drivers in London are women. That's a whole other topic. But a lot of these people were in the session were coming from more traditional firms, where you had, a cab office and a dispatcher who would sort of shout at the drivers and have favorites, and it was all pretty rough and tumble, not very nice. But when they came in here, Uber said, you know what, the best thing here about Uber is the algorithm decides who gets the work. Not this bad boss in the office who you have to humor. The algorithm decides. And there was a huge emotional cheer of 100 people on their feet cheering. And for me, coming from SAP, I never heard anybody cheer an algorithm before. But it tells you something about this. The final thing that I remember from that first day is that, coming from SAP, I was interested in real-time information, really good quality analytics. And I thought, this must be really interesting, because I bet you can show me where supply and demand is in real time on a map in London, on a heat map, and so on. And they kind of just looked at me stonily and said, yeah, that's proprietary information. You'll never see that. We can't share that with you. But I'm thinking, but I'm working for you. I'm on the team now. No, it wasn't to be. Next slide, please. And so this is the picture of all the work I did in London working for Uber. This is the data when I finally got my hands on it after many years and lots of lawyer letters. I got my data and I was able to map it. And this is everywhere I ever was. The red is slow speed. The lighter colors are higher speeds. Heathrow Airport on the left. And I even got to map and find through the data and through the GPS plotting an incident that changed my life and changed maybe the course of employment law, if you to read the academics. I was assaulted one night, and Uber would not identify to the police or to me who the passenger was, and they wouldn't cooperate with the police for 10 weeks. Next slide, please. And so I began to understand why that was. When I started looking at the contract, the way this is set up is that the driver is contracted with the passenger is contracted with the driver, and Uber is acting only as an intermediary. And so it doesn't want to really know about my little problems, because it doesn't want to trigger public liability with passengers, and it doesn't want to trigger employment liability with me. And so what you've got set up here is this very artificial contractual relationship that says, I'm the entrepreneur, I'm the transportation provider, they're simply a technology company. And you have to agree these things. That was the interesting thing that we found out in court, that the judges really attacked hard, was that we were not only agreeing obligations, but we were agreeing things that just weren't true. That is, that Uber is not a transportation company, it's a technology company. But, we had no bargaining power. So if Uber asked us to agree that the sky is green and the grass is blue, we would have said, sure, we'll sign that as well. And that brings you to the problem of these types of contracts. But the other element of control, undoubtedly, and has intensified, is surveillance and algorithmic control, algorithmic management control. Because this is all part of the misclassification game, to conceal the true relationship we're in. And make no mistake, we're in a relationship. And part of our struggle is to prove that we're in an employment relationship. And that means we have to evidence the management control. And increasingly, that's hidden in algorithm. You know, have you ever been in a situation where you're trying to convince the other person that you're in a relationship with them and they deny that they are? I mean, before Uber, the last time that happened to me was in high school, but that's another talk. Next slide, please. And so we get into this spinning game. So we spin the data. So 1 week I worked 91 hours. I earned 503 an hour, which is about 75% of the national minimum wage at the time. And I only accepted about 40% of the work offered. Now, Uber went to court, and it also went to Parliament with this exact example and said, well, look at the sovereignty he had. He was able to decline all that work. But when I looked at the data, when I finally got it, I found, well, actually, my productivity rate was higher than what Uber was expecting at 40 to 6 hours. I was at 91 hours. It didn't really matter the work I was declining. What mattered was the work I was doing. And it made me at that moment realize that workers needed to control their data. They needed to be able to tell their own story. They needed to be able to defend themselves and bargain. Next slide, please. So we also spin the communication. So what Uber says is that you're not the worker, you're the customer. Get your head around that. You don't have a job, you have an opportunity to earn money. We can't call it a job. That might trigger a legal responsibility in employment. We're not a transportation company, we're definitely a tech company, except the courts have all said that that's not true and you're regulated as a transportation company. And you're definitely not fired or dismissed, you're deactivated or disaffiliated. Next slide, please. And so your performance managed by ratings, but these ratings are quite discriminatory and arbitrary. I don't think anybody in real life beyond Uber driving would want to be performance managed this way. But 1 star is a terrible service. This is verbatim, I'm giving you the explanation. 2 star is a bad trip, and I don't think that's a narcotics euphemism. 3 stars is pretty disappointing. 4 stars is okay, but there was definitely a problem. 5 stars is excellent. You get the drift here. There's only one. It's a binary system, good or bad. And at 4.4 average rating on your past 500 trips, you are fired or disaffiliated, as I might say. Next slide, please. And so we went to court and we won, and Lord Leggett and the unanimous ruling of the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom recognized, they saw through these contracts, they saw through the business processes that were encoded in algorithm, and they recognized that Uber drivers truly have little or no ability to improve their economic position through skill or professional or entrepreneurial skill, and that the only way that we could earn more money was to work more hours while constantly meeting Uber's measures of performance. And this simply isn't fair. Either it's an open market and we are free, or it is a closed market where performance managed and we have an employment relationship and the rights that go with it. Next slide, please. And so while we could pause here for 5 minutes and gaze at this, I often do myself. This is our victory pose outside the Supreme Court last month. Next slide, please. And so how has Uber reacted to this? Well, actually, Uber has doubled down. What Uber is trying to say now is, well, this judgment relates to how Uber was then, not how Uber is now. So Uber wants to make cosmetic changes to the business model, to the way the app works, maybe let you see the destination where you couldn't see it before. And then say, well, look, there's plausible deniability here. You mightn't have been free then, but you're definitely free now. And what we're seeing is a doubling down on algorithmic control. So we're less communication, more algorithmic control, more surveillance. There's a bit of a surveillance arms race in the gig economy at the moment in using geolocation, identity checks and facial recognition, but also algorithmic performance management. And the way this works is that the only thing worse than being fired is not being fired. You find that you're getting less work and you have this boiling frog syndrome where you can't make it, you're not earning enough and you fall away eventually. That's the brutal reality. Next slide, please. And so Worker Info Exchange was set up to tackle that problem. We're taking advantage of data access rights in the European Union under the EU GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. It gives us important rights of access to our data. Not only that, but also we're entitled to algorithmic transparency so that we understand how we have been managed by a platform like Uber. And then we also have rights to challenge automated decision-making that haven't had proper human intervention or you've been denied an appeal. And this is important for decisions relating to work allocation, deciding whether you're going to work or not, but also performance management and ultimately dismissals as well. Next slide, please. So what does the battleground for this data access look like? Well, the green box is the data we entered into the machine ourselves. I mean, there can be no dispute that that's our data. We gave it to you. Can we have it back, please? The amber box is the data that the machine observes about us at work, the geolocation information, the GPS traces, the customer ratings, the braking, acceleration, telematics information. We know Uber has all that. They don't like giving it to us. They don't like giving it to us in an orderly way, and we have to fight for that. But it's there. And then finally, the real battleground is the inference data. That is the decision that the machine is making about us, having observed us at work, our profiling, our classification according to performance. I won't get into it, but we know it exists. We have clear evidence of that type of profiling of workers, and that type of profile is put into the algorithmic decision-making, automated decision-making around things like work allocation. So it's really, really important that we have full transparency of that, and we do not yet. Next slide, please. And so the mission of what we're trying to do is access to data, algorithmic transparency. Those go hand in glove. Without just having your personal data alone is not enough. You need to understand how that was being processed through the body that is Uber. It's a bit like, you know, you get that injection of dye into your arm and you go have an MRI. So you don't just have your blood, you see how it's performing through your major organs in your body. It's the same way with the platform. We want to see how that data, our personal data, was processed through Uber systems, and that will give us a really clear indication of how we were managed, how decisions were made relating to us. And then when we identify these unfair decisions, we can challenge them illegally. Next question, please. Legally and collectively, I might add, this is about building collective power, because even though we've had a great Supreme Court victory, the only long-term sustainable solution is collective power and collective intelligence, and that means a data trust for the masses. But we are taking legal challenges against Uber and Ola in Amsterdam, where the data is being held on grounds of access. We haven't been given proper access to our data. We have not been given algorithmic transparency, and we have not. We've also brought a bunch of cases where drivers have been deactivated unfairly, and we say that they've been deactivated in an automated way without proper human intervention or without any right of appeal, and we say that's illegal. Those cases are before the courts, and we're waiting for decisions shortly. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide, and what I wanted to do was return to the topic of purpose. You know, I don't mind telling you, I shed tears when I saw that Supreme Court ruling, because it was a unanimous ruling, and which was unexpected. These were black letter lawyers. They were not known to be left-wing lawyers. They were commercial lawyers that went on to become judges with backgrounds in banking and insurance and such. And I wasn't sure how they would react to this topic, but they were pretty brutal on Uber. And what they said was so simple. After all the talk about contracts, after all the talk about how the app works, they simply said that the purpose of the law was to protect workers who are precarious in precarious circumstances, to protect vulnerable workers. That is the purpose of the law. And so when Uber constructs fake contracts like this for the purpose of cheating us out of those rights, those contracts cannot stand in law, and they have to be discarded and disrespected and discarded. And it's the same thing with algorithms. If you build algorithms, as Uber has done, if you build these processes that are automated and hidden for the purpose of concealing the true relationship, that there is an employment relationship here, those cannot stand either. They have to be exposed, and we have to evidence them as management in action, and therefore there's an employment relationship. So this idea of purpose is really, really important in your values, in the function of the software you're building, in the design decisions that you make, and most importantly, in your values. So I just invite you also to think about, in the work that you do every day, what is your purpose, and how can you help people like me in future not have to spend 6 years in court against a company like Uber. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. I really, I love that talk and the work you're doing. And just the ending with that idea of purpose, and the purpose of like labor law or human rights law is to protect us. So we take those rights for granted in many societies. And then this connection to the idea of a data trust for gig workers' data, like unless we actually can use our data rights in a practical way, we can't actually take advantage of the rights that we take for granted. So it really, that connection is very clear here. And it's also what the Data Futures Lab that Mozilla, Illuminate, and Siegel and others are setting up and Mozilla's work on trustworthy AI really need to focus on that connection between real human needs and life and rights, and how we give people power over the data to tap into that.
I honestly, I couldn't agree more. I mean, thinking about data and power and the fact that like everyone who uses the internet, who uses technology, like should have a say and a role to play around like shifting the power dynamics around data. Such an important point, and love James' talk for that. And that gets me thinking, actually going back to the example that I shared earlier, Mark, about China using AI to enhance the censorship efforts. So when we're thinking about like the using AI to shift the power dynamic, one of the initiatives that is supported by OTF, the Open Technology Fund, where I currently work, is called the Geneva Project, and it's led by researchers at the University of Maryland. And what they're trying to do is that they're trying to shift this balance of power in the case of the censorship race by using AI as well. So they developed a tool that uses AI and that uses machine learning to automatically learn about the new blocking techniques and analyze how to circumvent censorship by the Great Firewall of China. Just imagine what that could mean for residents of China who want to access a free and open internet, to then have access to this data and to have access to this research and understand, you know, how to be able to access an open and free internet that way. And the idea of like, you know, what this means for end users and how important it is to shift the power dynamic, I think connects very well to our next speaker and what she's about to talk about. So would you like to introduce her, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does. I'm happy to introduce my colleague, Brandy Gerkink, one of our senior campaigners here at Mozilla. Brandy is a part of a growing collection of people who are focused on the idea that data donations, people sharing their own data with researchers, with nonprofits, with people who are trying to tackle these issues, that citizens can get involved in shifting power around data. So Brandy, are you here? You want to join us on this virtual stage? There you are. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mark. Hi, I'm Brandy. I want to start off today by telling you a few stories about the impact of data and power on human lives. These stories aren't mine, but I can see myself and my own story in each of them. Growing up, I wanted more than anything else to be a dancer. That didn't work out because I'm a terrible dancer, but I remember all of the time that I spent at the studio and all of the friends that I made along the way. And I think back on that time in my life really fondly. So it hit extra hard when I read this one mother's story about her little girl. Next slide, please. She wrote, "My 10-year-old sweet daughter innocently searched YouTube for tap dance videos and now is in this spiral of horrible extreme dance and contortionist videos that give her unsafe, body-harming, and body image damaging advice. I've tried to go in and manually delete all recommended videos, put in parental controls, everything. But she's finding ways to log on using browsers and school computers. These terrible videos just keep being recommended to her. I heard her downstairs saying, 'Work to eat, work to drink.' I don't know how I can undo the damage that's been done to her impressionable mind." Instead of becoming a dancer, I went on to study political science at a university that was affectionately referred to as the most liberal square footage in South Carolina. I was lucky that for me and my friends, it was a really welcoming and inclusive and safe space to learn more about ourselves and our identities. I heard a story the other day that reminded me how our online spaces can be anything but that. Next slide, please. In coming out to myself and close friends as transgender, my biggest regret was turning to YouTube to hear the stories of other queer and trans people. Simply typing in the word transgender brought up countless videos that were essentially describing my struggle as a mental illness and as something that shouldn't exist. YouTube reminded me why I hid in the closet for so many years. So after I graduated, I was really fresh with idealism about all of the ways that through my work, I could change the world and make the world a better place. I had a really specific worldview, and my politics had definitely been shaped by the past few years spent at university and the process of really learning how to think critically. It became more and more difficult for me to connect with members of my family who at the time were embracing like alternative facts. And I didn't always respond the way that I wish I would have, like with empathy and with understanding, which is why I respect and value so much this story. Next slide, please. My stepfather is an 80-year-old retired scientist from Ecuador. He was always curious about all sources of wisdom, theories, and knowledge, and is very literate and educated. But for a few years, he has become quite lonely and spends a large amount of time on the internet, and on YouTube in particular. His curious mind quickly brought him towards multiple conspiracy theories, Illuminati, other alien-based stories. Despite the fact that we tried to erase his YouTube history and clean his browser, his recommendations are completely filled with these kinds of videos. He sometimes falls asleep while watching. His days are filled by such content, which has quite strongly affected his worldview towards a much grimmer and more pessimistic turn. It seems impossible for us, his family, to fight against the recommendation algorithms that steer his life. In order to put his story in context, as well as the others, it's really important that we all better understand the platform that all of this is happening on. Next slide. YouTube is one of the most powerful recommendation engines on our planet. It's the world's second most visited website. Adults on average spend nearly 5 hours per week on the platform. And YouTube's recommendation AI drives 700 million hours of watch time on the platform every day. Next slide. The 10-year-old girl in the story that I shared, she didn't actively seek out videos about eating disorders. She was steered towards them. Why? How many other 10-year-old girls were suggested to watch similar videos? How many trans and queer people were subjected to hate and abuse on the platform when they were looking for community? Next slide. 1 billion hours of YouTube are watched every single day, but it's impossible to know about the impact that this platform, and especially the recommendation engine, is having on our societies, because YouTube makes it really, really hard to study their platform. Without information about what YouTube is recommending to us or to our parents or to our children and why, we have no way to scrutinize those decisions or contextualize the stories. We are made powerless without the information that we need to understand if and how this system might be working against our best interests. Next slide. But it doesn't have to be that way, because you and me and Mark and Sarah and James and Kathleen, we all have a lot more power than we might think. If you're a person who uses social media, or more broadly, a person who uses the web, and since this is a virtual conference, that means you hold a tremendously valuable piece of the puzzle, which is what you are seeing online, your own personalized social media feed, your recommendations, your stories. You can use this power to drive change. Next slide. So in 2019, after years of seeing news reports like these about harmful YouTube recommendations that were driving people to the internet's darkest corners, we decided that the only way to really understand this problem at scale was for YouTube to make their recommendation algorithm more transparent. I sent an email to the Mozilla community asking people whether they had a story to tell us about getting served harmful YouTube recommendations. Next slide. Before the week was up, thousands of people had come forward to tell us their stories. 3 of those were people whose stories I told you a few minutes ago. The mother whose 10-year-old daughter began starving herself, the trans person who was made to feel ashamed of who they are, the person whose final years with their stepfather were derailed by paranoia and by conspiracy theories. These stories were so powerful. I thought, if we can tell these to YouTube and we can show them the real harm that this is having in people's lives, then we can convince them that they have to act. So we brought them into a meeting with YouTube, and we read them out loud, and we tried to urge YouTube to release information that would allow the public to dig deeper on some of these examples, to understand where things were going wrong and what could be done about it. Next slide. But months passed with no action from YouTube. They weren't releasing any of the data that we had been asking them to. But those stories stuck with me throughout all of those months. Our campaign had raised awareness of this problem, but as each day passed, another 1 billion hours were spent on YouTube feeding their AI with more and more data, and they were refusing to act. So then one day I thought, why are we waiting around for this company to do the right thing? Could there be another way? If thousands of people had responded to my email, sharing their story with us to pressure YouTube to do the right thing, might those same people be willing to go a little bit further, to actually share data and hard evidence of the rabbit holes that they were stuck in on YouTube? What would putting thousands of these examples together reveal about the way that YouTube were manipulating our behavior and shaping our view of the world? Would people trust us with their data, knowing that we would use it in an effort to improve the experience for others? Could we build this in a way that protected people's privacy and wasn't exploitative or extractive? If YouTube wouldn't tell us what was going on, could we start to understand it ourselves? Next slide. So I started talking with some of my colleagues at the Mozilla Corporation, and together, actually a couple of years ago at MozFest, the idea for the Regrets Reporter was born. We decided that we would build a browser extension to enable people to send us the harmful recommendations that they were getting on YouTube right as it happened. Next slide. The Regrets Reporter lets you take action in real time with just 3 easy steps. 2,000 people had shared their stories in our first campaign, but when we released this tool, more than 10 times that number of people came forward wanting to participate in just the first 2 months that it was live. Through the Regrets Reporter, we're already starting to see patterns in those people's experiences. We're starting to understand where harm is occurring and hold YouTube accountable, despite the fact that our user base is just a teeny tiny fraction of all of the people who watch YouTube. I've used YouTube as an example here, but this story is bigger than YouTube. It's a story about data and power. Regrets Reporter is part of a growing movement of data donation projects that are powered by people like you and me, people who understand that our own data and our experiences are what give these algorithmic systems their power. But we have a choice in how we use that power, and we have to take a more active role in using that and understanding that we have the ability to do so. So beyond Regrets Reporter, which works with YouTube, there are also so many other examples of people taking action to create transparency where there isn't any. Next slide. There's Ad Observatory, which is run by a group of researchers out of New York University, and What's Crap on WhatsApp, which is run by Africa Check and Volume. There's Citizen Browser, a project by investigative newsroom The Markup, and Tracking Exposed, which is run by a small team of people who have been doing this work for many, many years now. Next slide. There's also really great work being done on this by my colleagues over on the Mozilla Corporation side. They've repurposed the data platform that they built to support Firefox product development at scale into a data donation platform that can support research and advocacy organizations. Mozilla Rally is a data donation platform that enables people to donate their data to causes that they care about. We hold 2 beliefs close: that people have the right to choose who they share their data with, and that there are communities who have actionable ideas about how to use that data to increase transparency on the internet and to build better technology. Over the past year, we've been focusing on building open source tools to enable communities to develop their own data donation projects, and we're excited to launch with our first partners this quarter. Next slide. And this is really just the start. Because transparency isn't an end goal in itself. Transparency is the starting point from which we can understand what is happening enough to be able to challenge it, to contest it, to try to change it. Eventually, if we can understand these systems well enough and know what is happening on them, we can imagine how they can be better. We can imagine how to build algorithms that are optimized for the well-being of our communities and not the profit motivations of a handful of companies. We can start building a future so that decades from now, when that 10-year-old little girl in the story is all grown up and maybe she has a daughter of her own, that child will be safe online. The internet will be a place where she can discover who she is and connect with content that allows her to explore and to grow in her talents. We can build online spaces that value inclusion and freedom for those who are historically and presently marginalized. So not one more young queer or trans person is targeted with shaming and harassing content just because of who they are. Our online spaces can be places that help our aging parents and loved ones feel more connected and less alone in the world. Next slide. Shifting power starts from a handful of people who believe that they can. Join us in doing so. Thank you.
Brittany, thank you so much for this talk. I love the idea of not having, unfortunately, not having to wait for corporations to respond to our request for more accountability and more transparency. And I love this story that you shared about basically how you just flipped the table there and kind of took matters into your own hands. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, really amazing, Brandy. Thanks so much. And I would say your talk and all of these talks remind me of why I joined Mozilla in the first place, and frankly, why we started MozFest 10 years ago. This kind of ethos of not just talking about what's broken on the internet, but rolling up your sleeves and doing something to fix it. And that's what Firefox was about originally, with open source and open standards. And it's why we're focused on trustworthy AI today. It just all ties back to those values in the Mozilla manifesto. And I'm so grateful for the work that all three of our speakers, and frankly, everybody here at MozFest is doing kind of in pursuit of that roll up your sleeves and advance those values kind of approach. And I'm committed to doing everything I can to help these people succeed and putting Mozilla's resources and muscle behind that.
Thank you, Mark. And that makes me very happy to hear as well. Mostly because I think truly Mozilla has such a unique chance to carve itself a spot in this conversation about AI and to distinguish itself from other companies. Because you've already done this in so many ways. Like, for example, just like you talked about Firefox really cemented itself and cemented its place as a privacy-first browser. And now Mozilla has a chance to kind of do the same thing, but with AI principles and AI development. And I would say really more than just a chance. I think Mozilla has a responsibility to do it because it's so tied to your core values. You've already all funded work and people like myself, whether it was like the Open Web Fellowship or the Policy Fellowships, towards like building towards that future essentially. And there is truly a responsibility, not just a chance, but a responsibility to keep going in that direction. And we all know this, like we know technology is not neutral. The way that we make technology, the way that we conceptualize it, how it fits into our culture, the problems it solves, those are all design decisions that can have a really deep impact on society. And you always have to be asking, like, what's the worst case scenario? What's the worst thing that can happen? And you have to plan for those use cases, even if they represent maybe 0.5% of the use cases that you might have. And like I said, I mean, we all know this on some level, just the conversation about AI and the impact that it can have on society. And what's important to remember is like the people who are the most vulnerable in society, the most likely to be harassed, the most likely to be surveilled, all the stories that were shared here today, those are also the people who are the most vulnerable to technology and to certain developments into technology. And when we put energy in protecting these people specifically, those who are maybe living in that dystopian future that we want to avoid, we end up protecting everyone. And we make sure that we as a society don't end up there. in that dystopian future. So in working on AI development, and in Mozilla working on AI development and principle, in being intentional about slower and more thoughtful development and thinking about AI at every step of that process, when we make sure that that 0.5% of people are safe, we end up building tools for everyone. And I want to mostly urge everyone to resist the feeling of inevitability, this idea that like we can't change the future. AI is just what it is. It's going to evolve this way. It's going to have an impact on people this way. And some people are going to be harmed by it. We like all these things of computing and all the technology development is almost impossible to rethink and impossible to redesign and to implement. But that's not true. Even though AI today might be becoming more opaque and more unaccountable and more divisive in many ways, there are very few companies that are stepping in and offering a different and healthy vision of computing and of AI development, and that are building on top of that. And Mozilla could totally play that role essentially and really shape that future, which obviously is going to completely steer the direction in which we're going to.
Thank you, Sarah. And I could not agree more. And I really appreciate the push. I mean, that is where we need to show up. And I would say, you know, I think back over the 10 years of MozFest and look at the people who I've already seen show up at MozFest this year. This community is a group of people who do not take the direction of technology and the digital world as inevitable. And certainly, I am committed to making sure that MozFest stays this way, and that Mozilla continues to back people who are trying to take technology practically, concretely in a different direction. So really excited and grateful to everybody who was on this panel and in this plenary for being here and showing that in action. And Sarah, for co-hosting with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to everybody who's here at MozFest. Hopefully you got some inspiration, but I know everything you're doing is sharing inspiration as we bounce off of each other. So enjoy the rest of MozFest and enjoy each other. Thanks very much.
Thank you.